Speaking Freely is the name of this podcast. It also happens to be, not coincidentally, the name of the first book I wrote in 2005 about the First Amendment. And not coincidentally, I think, there are two words used by Elon Musk last week in talking about his takeover, running now, or imminently, Twitter. And it occurred to me that there was no one better, no one more interesting, no one more learned for me to call and ask to talk with me a little bit about Twitter, about content moderation, about free speech on the internet, than Richard Hazen, a friend of mine for many years, the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California in Irvine, and the author of a really wonderful book that I'm holding in my hand called Cheap Speech, How Disinformation Poisons Our Politics and How to Cure It. So, good morning. Good morning, Professor Hazen.
It's great to be with you.
Let's start today with what Elon Musk said when he took over, when he announced that he was able to do that, and indeed when he was seeking it. One of the lines I found really interesting was this. He said, "It's really important that people have both the reality and the perception that they're able to speak freely within the boundaries of the law," end quote. So I'm interested in your reaction. I know you've written a whole book about it, but talk to us a little bit about the relationship between free speech and online commentary, talk, and the like. Is it, as Mr. Musk was saying, or should he have couched it, in terms of people being able to speak freely within the boundaries of the law, or are there and should there be greater limitations on it? Right?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'd say is that there's a lot of speech that the First Amendment protects. You can think of hate speech. You could think of certain forms of pornography. You could think of certain commercial speech that's objectionable. All kinds of things that the government would not have the ability, would not have the power, given the First Amendment, to censor. But yet it's stuff that most of us wouldn't want to see every day. So if Twitter were a completely unfiltered just stream of whatever anyone wants to put out, it would not be a very useful product. And if your only content moderation rule is does the law allow you to say it, then I don't think you're going to have a very useful platform. I don't think you're going to have a lot of people who are going to want to speak. So I don't think he literally means what he said, that what the law allows is going to be the kind of the limit or the typical thing that people are going to see. There's going to have to be content moderation. And he would want content moderation, if only to make this something that is useful and valuable. If you have just a fire hose of information and misinformation and objectionable speech, it's not a product people are going to want to buy.
And how do you articulate? How should one think of? I'm not talking about specific words now, but what sort of standards do you think a Twitter ought to use in deciding, to use a journalistic term, what's fit to print? I mean, how should, if you were advising them, what would you say about how they could decide in a methodology of getting out lots and lots, most probably, of the speech that people use and omitting some of it. How do you think about that?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is political speech. That seems to be what, at least in part, motivated Elon Musk to want to take over Twitter. He felt that there was too much censorship, self-censorship on the platform. And of course, the elephant in the room is whether Donald Trump, who was kicked off the platform for encouraging the violence of January 6th and for repeatedly spreading election lies, is going to be put back on the platform. That's the huge political question that I think we need to think about, and how he's going to address. And I think whatever he decides is going to be controversial. There was a lot of glee on the part of the right that maybe now not just Trump, but also others who have spread disinformation about political speech are going to be invited back. And I would advise, first of all, I should say, I don't view Twitter as a government actor. I think just like the New York Times or Fox News can decide what content they want to include, Elon Musk, as the new owner of Twitter, can decide what content he wants to use, he wants to include. So I'm not talking about government censorship, but as a matter of good practice, I think that keeping off the platform someone who has undermined the integrity of the election process by spreading lies repeatedly about the election being stolen with no legitimate basis for doing so, and who encouraged the violence that potentially could have led to interrupting the peaceful transition of power in the United States, that is someone who does not deserve to have the platform. And then just speaking more generally, I think that what you've seen with Facebook and Twitter and other platforms is a constant readjustment to try to figure out how do you balance the interests and needs of people to get good information without cutting them off from information they may not know that they want, but would want when they saw it. And we can talk about this later, about Twitter deciding to hide posts about Hunter Biden's laptop. So I do think there are sometimes overcorrections. But I think the platforms have been trying to give the people what they want, consistent with their mission of trying to make money, which is the other issue here. Is this a vanity project for the world's richest man, or is this actually going to be a product that is meant to turn a profit?
If you had to assess whether Twitter and whether all the other enormous entities that are, in a sense, at least its competitors, should move, would you move it more in the direction of sort of taking greater care not to carry, call it antisocial speech, or move more in the direction of more speech, even if now and then it crosses some line that you and I might agree on?
So I think that, there's two parts to that. One is, what's available to people if they want to find it. And I think that there should be wide availability. Although I favor the deplatforming of Donald Trump, I think there should be a huge thumb on the scale against removing political speech, even political speech that is objectionable. It's only when it crosses this line into undermining the very democratic process or encouraging violence that it does cross that line. So one question is, should it be available? The other question, though, is, how much should it be promoted? Because a lot of what these platforms are doing is not just deciding what's in or what's out, but how much attention something gets. And I certainly think that the purveyors of vaccine disinformation, election disinformation, those who are trying to rile us up to increase the polarization of American society, those people don't necessarily deserve a good platform. And again, I know that it gets very complicated with federal law and Section 230 and whether these platforms are publishers or not, but I think de facto they're making editorial decisions, just like the New York Post decides what's going to be on its front page and what might be buried later in the newspaper, or the local news station decides what's worthy of coverage. Those kinds of editorial decisions help shape people's realities, and so I think there's a responsibility there. And while lots of speech could be available, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be something that is at the top of everyone's feed.
I mean, in your view, have those decisions been politicized in their nature with respect to Twitter, Facebook, and the like?
I think the decisions are inherently political. There's no neutral standard to decide, for example, whether to include Donald Trump or not include him on the platform. You may remember that during the 2020 election season, I write about this a lot in Cheap Speech, because Trump was such an unprecedented political figure in the United States, the platforms didn't know exactly how to deal with him, and they started labeling his election-related speech. The labels were not very effective. In fact, the label that Facebook used at least some of the time, they said, click here for more information about elections, almost suggested that Trump was providing valuable information. And it was being, people were being directed to get more of it. So I think there's a lot of experimentation with what to do. You may also remember that after Facebook decided to remove Donald Trump following the events of January 6th, 2021, the Facebook Oversight Board, which is the kind of self-created Supreme Court for Facebook, said, you can't just remove a politician forever without having any criteria. So come up with some criteria and come up with an end date. And so Facebook said, all right, we're going to go 2 years and then we'll reevaluate. And the question is he still a danger to democracy? So that question is coming for Facebook. That it's an inherently political decision no matter what you do. And I don't think there's any way to avoid that any more than, if the New York Times decides it's going to make a story about what's going on with Hunter Biden right now. That's a political decision.
I don't understand. I don't understand what you mean, though, by a political decision. I mean, journalists at their best, I like to think, and I do think, make judgments which, of course, have political impact, but one would like a judgment to be made based on journalistic standards when one's talking about a newspaper. And I'm not quite sure what sort of standards one would want, but you don't mean that it's a political judgment in the sense that by its nature, the people that make those decisions are engaging in a political act, or do you?
Well, I think I mean it at a somewhat different level. So I think that good journalists, I'd say the journalists at the New York Times or journalists at NBC News, are deciding what is newsworthy, right? They're deciding what, under certain journalistic norms, would count as something that the public would want to know that would help to inform the public. But I think that decision itself in this world now, deciding to favor that over favoring disinformation, is itself a political decision. That is, there really is no longer, and this is a big theme in Cheap Speech, there is no longer a Walter Cronkite who we can rely upon, or that the whole public is going to rely upon as a neutral arbiter. And so just the very act of journalism, the very act of fact-checking, is now making a political statement that you are going to abide by these norms of reality. And so I completely agree with you and sympathize with you that I would make these same judgments. But doing so in this environment is making a political choice, as opposed to, and so let's talk about what's on the other side. If you look at the kind of the top shared items on Facebook on a typical day, many of them do not abide by normal journalistic norms. Many of them spread disinformation and misinformation about vaccines or elections or any of this other stuff. So when you decide to go the newsworthiness route, to follow normal journalistic ethics, you're making a political choice. I think the correct political choice, but it's still a political choice. And I don't know that Elon Musk is going to make that choice. If he takes a really libertarian view that just let the market sort it out, and it's not for us to make any journalistic first cuts, then you end up with this very unfortunate situation, I think, where misinformation and disinformation can rise to the top because it's very cheap to produce fake news, misinformation, disinformation. There's a large appetite for it because it gives some people what they want, and it becomes part of a political struggle. So when the fact checkers are attacked as biased, that's the world that we're living in, even when the fact checkers are following what you and I would agree are longstanding norms of good journalism.
Do you think, or put it this way, if you were Elon Musk, if you were running one of these entities, I mean, how would you decide? What would you tell your employees to, to do with respect to some newsworthy person who was saying something about vaccines, which in your view was false?
Well, I really think you could ask the same question about what would you do if you were running CBS News or running the Wall Street Journal and face the same question, which is, if you're going to allow people to present that information because it's newsworthy, it's coming from a major celebrity or political source, you need to report it, but report it in context, right? So Donald Trump claimed again in an interview yesterday that the 2020 election was stolen, and there's no good evidence that it was. There's all good evidence that it wasn't. Don't present that in a way that is unmediated. Present that in a way that puts it in context. And now that's a lot harder to do when you think about the volume of speech that comes on social media. And so I think what you need to do is target the most curating of content and the most consideration of what should be included, what should be promoted for those who are the largest speakers on the platform. Elon Musk himself has over 80 million Twitter followers. He has a tremendous megaphone. It's only going to get larger as he owns the company. I'm reminded of that quote from A.J. Liebling that freedom of the press is for those who own one. And, he's going to have a tremendous platform, just like Jeff Bezos has a tremendous platform in the Washington Post. And I think with that great power does come responsibility to try to put false information in context for people so that they're not taken in by false statements, and so it doesn't tear our society apart and undermine the kinds of respect for truth-telling and the scientific method that we need if we're going to have a society that can function as a healthy democracy, both healthy in the public health sense and healthy in the democratic sense.
What does context mean with respect to someone who sends a tweet with information which you and I and the science community would agree is false? I mean, what's the answer to that? Not to run it, take it down, answer it? Answer it sounds more like a newspaper again now.
Right.
So, I mean, where would you go? Or are you suggesting changing the whole notion of a Twitter so that the editors, as it were, would be making decisions of this sort?
So we've seen Twitter and Facebook and others experiment with demoting the content. It's still there. People can still find it if they want to find it, but it's not prominent. So that's one thing that can be done, is to, when someone, I would have a kind of recidivism standard. When someone has consistently spread demonstrably, empirically false information, then at the very least, their stuff should be demoted. It should not get a lot of attention. And when it is, then I do think that surrounding it with fact checks and giving people the ability to determine that information is false is a valuable tool. Let me use an example from cheap speech. One of the things that we know that's coming down the pike are these so-called deep fakes. These are manipulated video or audio files that might make it look like Joe Biden's having a heart attack or Donald Trump is saying a racial epithet, or someone can make a fake video. And if that's just put up without context, some people are going to believe it. And it's also going to lead to this larger problem, which is that everyone's going to disbelieve everything they see, even with their own eyes. And that makes it hard to tell what's true, too. So one of the things I advocate in the book is not let's outlaw deep fakes, let's make them illegal. I don't think that's consistent with the First Amendment. But I say label those deep fakes as altered. So when someone is watching the video, they will have some context. Or I'll give another example from the Cheap Speech book. We talked about journalistic standards. I think that journalistic societies privately, not through the government, should organize together, and they should come up with some standards for what does it mean to be a good journalist. It means, do you have two sources for any statement you make? Do you give the person you're writing about a chance to respond? And you could come up with these criteria, and then you could give the kind of good housekeeping seal of approval to whoever abides by these standards. That have a little symbol that shows, okay, the Los Angeles Times, they're reputable. Breitbart, maybe not. We can have a debate over whether Breitbart abides by these standards or not. And then that little symbol could appear on social media next to the name of the company. So okay, it's from the Los Angeles Times. They have agreed to abide by these things. Chances are better that this stuff is true than coming from some fake news source that looks like a newspaper. So there are things we can do to give voters better tools to be able to know what's true without engaging in censorship.
And what would you do about statements not of fact, but of what I will call unpopular opinion? I mean, what about pro-Russian statements with respect to the Ukraine? What about anti-American statements with respect to our policy anywhere around the world? Would you label any of that or not?
I'm much less concerned about unpopular opinion than I am about false information. People can have their opinions about whether Russia's doing a good thing or a bad thing and going into Ukraine without it affecting their ability to make choices about how they're going to vote, what political action they're going to take. That's very different from a Russian misinformation that claims, for example, that no civilians were being targeted in particular areas in Ukraine. That's the kind of information I would target. But again, remember, we don't know what Elon Musk is doing, if this is a vanity project and he doesn't care about making money. He seems to care about making money otherwise. If he does care about making money, then I think, if Americans have a platform filled with posts that are anti-American, I don't think they're going to enjoy it very much. So there are going to be lots of business reasons why this stuff is not going to spread in this way either. So, I think, we talk about these as what would be the best decisions to be made consistent with the public interest. But I don't know that that's how Elon Musk is going to approach things. I certainly don't think that's how Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook has approached things. I think he's asked what's good for the power of Facebook. And he's only made better political choices because he's faced pressure, not just from the public and from, government, leaders, but also from his own employees who feel like the platform is being misused and creates a venue for destabilizing democracy.
Give me an example on Facebook, for example, of Zuckerberg carrying something. I mean, put aside a generalized desire to make money, but carrying something that you wish or you think he shouldn't have.
So there's a great example that I talk about in Cheap Speech where people were getting all kinds of misinformation and incendiary election-related speech in their feeds. And the algorithm that Facebook was using to do this, basically, if you liked something, it gave you more of it or a more extreme version of it. We've talked about this kind of problem. It's not clear how far it goes, but there's at least some extent that you get a little bit more radicalized or a little bit more extreme content. So right after January 6th, Facebook algorithm, they decided to flip a switch. And so instead of getting, Breitbart and other incendiary things at the top of your feed, you started getting NPR. They called it a kind of kinder, gentler Facebook. You were getting more factual information, less of what you might have wanted, more of what you probably needed if you were trying to get accurate information. And employees at Facebook liked it, and they asked, could we keep it this way? And Mark Zuckerberg said no. It was just for the emergency of January 6th. Now that the emergency has passed, now that it looks like we're going to have a peaceful transition of power, let's flip the algorithm back onto its original algorithm. That is a decision that is motivated, I think, not because of a commitment to free speech or a commitment to the public interest, but because that's what's going to make him more money, because it's giving the people what they want.
But motivation aside, isn't what you're advocating at its core anti-democratic? I mean, when you say giving the people what they want as if that were a slur, aren't you moving away from the notion that it's a good thing to have a place where people can express with exuberance their views on life, on politics, on sports, whatever?
Oh, I absolutely think they should have the ability to express, whatever they want, so long as they don't cross the line into something like defamation or, I would say, again, not a government thing, but in terms of what people want to see, hate speech or, glorification of Nazism. I mean, there are certain things I think we might have to tolerate, but as a society under the First Amendment, but we wouldn't necessarily want to see. So I think people should be able to express themselves. But I also think that, and this is the main theme of the Cheap Speech book, I think that what we've lost as we moved from a scarcity of speech into this fire hose is we've lost intermediaries that help us to make good decisions consistent with our interests and values. And we get taken in by conspiracy theories and misinformation that can have real negative consequences for our democracy. And so the question is not by government fiat. Again, I'm not calling for censorship, but the question is, how do you rebuild the intermediaries? So obviously the news media is one of those intermediaries. Let me give you another one. Political parties. We're in a situation of very intense partisanship in this country, but we have very weak political parties. So think about someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's got some, what I consider to be pretty hateful ideas. In the old days, 30 years ago, if she wanted to be up and coming in power in Congress, she'd have to depend on party leaders to give her campaign money, to be able to raise funds. Today, she can go directly to millions of followers, put up something incendiary, put up a link, it costs almost nothing, and she can get a whole bunch of people sending her a little bit of money, right? So this is another example where, because of changes in technology, we've changed the ability of people who are more responsible, people who can lead us towards better choices, to be able to do that. And so, yeah, I do think that the public, there is a demand, at least on the part of the public, and it's asymmetrical right now. This is more of a problem on the right than the left, although I'm not convinced it's going to stay that way. There's a demand for misinformation. There's a demand for polarization and an attempt to, and this comes directly from Trumpism, to tear down all those intermediaries that help voters decide what's true and what's false. I mean, think about who Donald Trump attacked. It was the opposition party, the press as the enemy of the people, the FBI, right? The judiciary. These are all the bodies that help us with truth telling, even attacking his own political party. Anyone who doesn't agree with Trump is a rhino, right? So there is, this undermining of the fabric of society because people are busy. They don't have time to spend all day studying politics and figure out what's happening in the world. They rely on intermediaries to give them valuable information. And as those intermediaries are torn down and you just have a free-for-all, I think that creates some very tough conditions for being able to have a democratic discussion.
And I agree with a lot of what you said in terms of social policy. It does give me more than a qualm in the sense that I'm not sure I want the people who run the Facebooks and the Twitters of the world to be making, in that case, an overtly political decision or an overtly, here's the way you ought to be thinking about this decision. Isn't that a problem?
Well, I go back to what I said earlier, which is I don't think that there is a neutral way to think about this. If you decide to have it unmediated, that's a decision too. That is, there is no neutral position. There's no natural state of what a social media platform should look like. So you've got to make some decisions. Yeah. And I think, I'm not happy that Elon Musk is going to take over Twitter and likely restore Donald Trump. I don't think that, the solution is a law that says you must carry this politician. You may not carry this politician. I think that's very dangerous. Just think of whatever president you can't stand being the one who gets to appoint the speech czar. So that's not a good solution. I do think it's a problem when a handful of people have so much power over what content we see. But then if we're going to use law to deal with that, I would point to different kinds of law than speech restrictions. I would point to things like antitrust law. So should it be that Meta owns Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram, that Google controls not just search, but also YouTube and these? So maybe we need to break up these platforms so that there's more competition. Part of the problem with that is a network effect. So, I saw a lot of people yesterday talking, and I was one of them. Is it going to be time to leave Twitter if Elon Musk changes it? Well, where would you go, right? Because there is something to be said for having enough people in the area that you want to write in or read about be in the same place to be able to have a conversation. So there are some difficult questions about these network effects, but I do think more competition is a way. And also, and this may be less obvious, greater privacy controls. I think that, a lot of the business model of these companies depends on mining data about us and using that for profit. And that whole business model is one that sells the ability to manipulate people's opinions through data that they've given up that they don't even realize they've given up just when they're clicking through and searching or reading different things online.
You're not talking, I take it, about announcing, so to speak, this data, this private, so to speak, data. It's using it.
Right. Yeah. So I'm saying that we might put limitations on its use. These are ways of, and I know you and I have talked about whether or not this kind of data collection is itself protected by the First Amendment or not. But I do think that thinking about privacy, thinking about antitrust, these are ways of trying to deal with market power, any more than, think about Fox News or think about the New York Times. They are also companies that have great power over what people think. And yet, we don't say, they should be neutral. We don't say that the government can come in and tell them what they have to say or can't say. The best solution is more competition.
Right. Here's my last question for the day. I look back on the days towards the end of the last century in which there were 3 networks and there were highly respected people who broadcast every night, the Walter Cronkite situation or benefit and the like. in which there were more newspapers rather than fewer. Taken as a whole, are we better off today with the explosion of online communication?
Yeah, I mean, that is a huge question, and I don't have an answer. What I would say is the communications revolution has had tremendous benefits. I mean, think about how much easier it is to express yourself today. Think about how posting a cell phone video of police brutality can spark a racial justice movement. Think about how you have the world's knowledge literally in the palm of your hand in your smartphone, and you can respond to it. All of those are good. But I think, and you know, my book, Cheap Speech, the title comes from an article that Professor Eugene Volokh wrote back in the 1990s, where he was celebrating what was coming, this opening up of things. But on the other hand, it does have this dark side. And this is what I was talking about with the loss of intermediaries. When we're all at sea, when we're in the middle of a flood of information, it's very hard to get your bearings. And so we don't want to go back to channels 2, 4, and 7 and that's it. But I think we also don't want to be in a situation where the hedge funds have bought up all the local newspapers, and the only local news that people can get is produced as a kind of political propaganda by the political parties or by others, which is the trend that we're starting to see. We want voters and citizens and people living in the country to be able to get accurate information and be able to understand the state of the world, and not to literally die because they are exposed to misinformation that somehow feeds some kind of a psychological or political need. And so I think it's a mixed bag. We're not going back. And so the question is, how do we navigate through this with a commitment to both, you know, free and robust debate and dialogue, but also one that respects science, the rule of law, and democracy. And these are among the most difficult social questions that we're going to face for the next generation.
And I'm afraid we can't decide them today. Thank you so much for appearing. You were, as I said, my first choice to come and talk about these issues, and I'm very appreciative to you for doing so. Thanks.
I appreciate the opportunity. Really enjoyed our conversation.